this is serious. This is not a war of choice. I mean, Putin is making war in Europe and threatening everybody. And unless he is seen to fail, we will all be a great deal poorer and less sensitive. And I think that message is now clear. I mean, different European countries have different views of what they should do about it, but very few European leaders and European publics now think we shouldn't do anything about it. We should just leave it. Most Europeans now understand that this is our problem and we've got to take it on. And I think that's very different to the situation of a year ago. But the things that they need this week and this month are artillery shells, 155 millimeter, 152 millimeter, tank rounds, 120 millimeter rounds for tank guns, and ammunition and systems for air defense. In particular, they need more Patriot batteries, and Patriot batteries are about $1 billion each. And of that, about 400 million is the cost of the battery, and up to 600 million is the cost of the different ammunition, a lot of ammunition that they fire. So they need air defense quickly because the Russians are able to use their air force in a standoff mode from many miles away, throwing glide bombs into cities like Kharkiv and along the front line, which is playing havoc with Ukrainian defenses. So if they can neutralize that quickly, that will make a big difference. But then beyond that, beyond ammunition and anti-aircraft artillery, they need more equipment of every sort so that they can reorganize themselves properly for the rest of the year. The problem the Ukrainians have, first of all, is missiles and glide bombs hitting their cities. So Chernihiv, Sumy, and particularly Kharkiv, which is the second city right on the Russian border, or the border with Western Russia, are very vulnerable. Now, Kharkiv is a big city, but the Russians look as if they are trying to do to that city what they did to Mariupol down in the south. It's a bigger city and they'll find that more difficult. But they're going for the power, the water supplies. They're trying to actually make life intolerable in the city, and they're attacking civilian areas. And they're doing it in two ways. One is with ballistic missiles, such as the Iskander missile, which is not impossible to defend against, but you need good anti-aircraft systems like the Patriot to defend against an incoming ballistic missile. And the other way they're doing it is with these glide bombs called the FAB 500, FAB 500, and there's a FAB 1500. And the 500 is a 500 kilo bomb, which is 1,000 pounds. The 1500 is a 1,500 kilo bomb, which is 3,000 pounds. In effect, it's about 1.5 tons of warhead. And these are very old bombs, and the Russians have got literally thousands and thousands of these bombs, but they found a way of fitting little wings to them and giving them a very crude guidance system. So these bombs can be dropped by aircraft at 30,000 feet, up to 50 or 60 miles behind the front line, and they will glide from that height to their target, and they'll hit their target with enough accuracy, given that they're big bombs. If they're 20 or 30 meters away from the target, they'll still do a lot of damage. And those glide bombs are something that are very difficult to defend against. There's no easy defense against them. The only way that the Ukrainians can do anything about it is to hit the aircraft before they drop them. And that means that they either have to have good anti-aircraft missiles, long-range, high-altitude missiles, which they are now going to get, so they can target these aircraft when they are 30 and 40 miles away from the front line. But also they need their own aircraft. They need their F-16s and whatever other aircraft they may be able to get, and they're not going to get them soon. But they need them to be flying in some numbers to protect the airspace above their own front lines, and maybe to chase some of these Russian bombers, these Su-34s, Su-35s, into Russia. They've got to chase them way behind the front lines to keep them from dropping their glide bombs. The glide bomb, it sounds like a rather specific thing, but it's actually it's a weapon that's made a big difference to Ukraine over the last few months. The package is not quite too little too late, but it's certainly on the wrong side of the right time to arrive, put it that way. I mean, if this package had come in October when it was first proposed, then far fewer Ukrainians will be dead. Far fewer Russians will probably be dead, actually. And in fact, the Ukrainians would have maintained their lines and have been able to take a breath over the winter. Because this package has been delayed, they have lost some territory. They've certainly lost an awful lot of people because of it. And they're now going to have to try to get back what they've lost in the 6 months it's taken for this package to be agreed. However, the fact that the package has now been agreed is very important to Ukraine. I mean, in these wars, no one thing is a game changer, but in this case, this keeps Ukraine in the war for the rest of this year. It means that Ukraine won't lose the war this year. They won't win it this year either, but they will be able to hold their own. They'll be able to plan for the future, and they'll be able to make it impossible for the Russians to squeeze Ukraine into a political crisis, which is what they were trying to do, a political crisis in Kiev that would remove Zelensky and replace him with somebody who would then do a deal on the basis that the Russians would keep what they've conquered. I mean, this war represents the return of industrial age warfare to Europe. And industrial age warfare is won by the side that can produce more and deploy it onto the battlefields at the right time. Sounds easy to say, but of course it's very hard to do. And since the end of the Cold War, we've run down our defense industries. So did the Russians to some extent. But the Russians have now geared up into a war economy, and we haven't. So we're coming at this, as it were, from behind. But our capacity is much greater than the Russian capacity if we use it properly. So the whole point about industrial age warfare is that you have to be prepared to gear up armaments production, and you have to be prepared to think of ways in which you can deploy what is necessary, because industrial age warfare uses up lots and lots of resources. And we've seen the sort of ammunition usage on the front line in Ukraine. The Ukrainians were firing about 10,000 shells a day at one time, a day. And the Russians were firing almost 20,000 shells a day. So they're getting through 2 and 3 million shells a year. This is what is characteristic of industrial age warfare. It's not pretty. We don't like it, but that is where we are because of what Russia is trying to do to Ukraine and threatening to do to other European powers at some point in the future. I think what the Ukrainians will be able to do is to drive back some of these Russian attacks, because the Russian attacks of recent months have been almost human wave attacks. I mean, the British Ministry of Defence estimates that the Russians are losing 900 men a day, and that's killed and seriously injured. So 900 casualties every day along the front. And they can't afford to keep doing that, and they'll lose more than that when the Ukrainians get more ammunition. The only reason they're only losing 900 is because the Ukrainians simply run out of shells to fire. They're running out of even small arms ammunition in some places. So as the Ukrainians, which they will by the end of this week, start to get more artillery ammunition for sure, then they will be able to push back these reckless Russian attacks. And I think that will be the immediate effect. I think Russian casualties will increase a lot in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and they will lose a lot more of their equipment. So I don't expect the Ukrainians to, as it were, suddenly go onto the offensive, but I think they will stop losing territory in most places. They might still lose Chasiv Yar, which will be a real problem if they do, but we'll see. But if they can hold on where they are now and then gradually push the Russians back, then they will be able to take a breath before the summer and then have some control over the situation. The problem for the Ukrainians is that everything was happening helter-skelter, and they were losing control of what they were trying to do. If you can dig in and establish, as it were, a stalemate on the front, you then can start to plan for what you do next. And one of the most important elements of this aid package that was agreed at the weekend in the United States is that it now allows the Ukrainians to plan for the future. They couldn't plan when they were falling back throughout with lack of ammunition. Now they can begin to plan for what they do in the future. And of course, they want to try to get it right for the end of the year and into next year, when they might be able to make a more decisive difference. I think the Kremlin had assumed that the aid package wouldn't go through. Part of their offensive all the way around the front was based on the idea that they could squeeze the Ukrainians, and that the United States would not deliver the aid package, and therefore they would create a political crisis in Kyiv. The fact that the aid package has been agreed is not only good in military terms on the front line, it's extremely important for Kyiv's morale. It's also important for the Europeans, because the Europeans now have to match it. They have to show that they really mean it and get in behind America, which they are beginning to do, or that they're doing to a reasonable extent, but they now need to do it more. And for the Kremlin, this is a disastrous week, because they had based their current offensive on the assumption that the aid package wouldn't go through. And the fact that it's gone through also leads to other problems, which the Russians will have as Kiev becomes more confident and is able to breathe a bit from the pressure that it's been under since last year, in effect. The problems that the Russians will now have is that their current offensive, which is not very strong strategically, but it is pressuring in all places, that will run out of steam. They will have used up a lot of equipment. They'll have had a lot of men killed and injured, and they will get exhausted. Putin demanded that they press all the way along the front, and you can only do that for so long before the troops get exhausted. And if they don't achieve objectives and give themselves a chance to rest, if they themselves come under pressure, which may now be the case, then they literally lose combat effectiveness. And that may well happen. And the Russians are already trying to pretend that this aid package is very dangerous. It increases the danger of a nuclear exchange. And they use this magic word nuclear all the time. Every time something goes wrong for them, they threaten nuclear war. And the real nuclear threat is no greater now than it was before this war started. But the Russians always use the phrase because they try and frighten everybody with it. And there's some evidence that they have succeeded in frightening some people with it. And so that's what they're doing now. And so whenever they start to threaten nuclear Armageddon in Europe, you know that they're having a bad day. And that's what they've been doing since Saturday. It's very interesting to work out why Trump has changed his view a little bit on Ukraine and why he gave Mike Johnson the leeway to change his view. I don't know what the answer is, but I suspect it was that Trump was looking at the buildup of commentary about it because, I mean, he says that he can stop the war. If he becomes president, he'll stop the war in 24 hours. And the reason he can do that is that he'd cut off all aid and Ukraine would have to surrender. I mean, every war will stop within 24 hours if one side surrenders. And that was his solution to the war. And I think in a way, going into the presidential election, I think either he or his people around him perceived that was not going to play very well when it was subject to real scrutiny on the campaign trail. You know, his supporters will believe it because they believe anything he says. But the middle ground people will actually be a bit wary of the idea that this man will stop a war by telling the side that's been victimized, the side that's been attacked, simply to give up and surrender. And I think when Trump thought about it, I think he realized that he needed greater nuance in his stance. And the nuance he provided was enough to put this aid package, within the realms of the possible. And it goes with a few caveats. There's some face-saving caveats in it, which were not in the original package, so that there's some control over the way the money is spent in Ukraine, though most of it is spent in America. There's some discretion for the president to pull the whole thing back if he didn't think it was being spent properly. I'm sure that's not unreasonable. There were some issues in it regarding the supply of Atacama missiles, the ground attack missiles, that gives the president some discretion. But on the other side of it, it was also accompanied by a bill to seize up to $8 billion worth of assets that are presently frozen and give them to Ukraine. And that goes above and beyond what anybody expected, because that's actually quite a big step and quite a controversial step. And I was genuinely surprised to see a Republican measure suggesting that. But there you are, they've done it. And so that's a bonus for Ukraine, although it may create some legal complications down the line. Freezing assets are one thing, but freezing them and then seizing them is another, legally complicated, and it sends out a bad message to investors for the next number of years. But we'll see how that works out. The Europeans are stepping up their support in lots of different ways. The EU had a 50 billion euro package, which they thought would help to compensate for the lack of an American package. And then that 50 billion package was accepted, but has been put into installments, so it won't have the same effect, but it will be useful. But on the other hand, a lot of European countries individually now, given that if they can't use the EU framework in the way that they had hoped, they're doing things individually. So the Estonians have scoured the world looking for artillery shells and have come up with about 1.2 million shells that they can buy. The Czech Republic has done the same. They've come up with about 1.3 million artillery shells that they think they can buy. And so there's over 2 million artillery shells available that would fit Ukrainian systems, which will cost about 3 billion euros to buy. So if the Europeans can commit that money, they can pull these shells in. Now, that won't happen immediately because they're not sitting in Poland already. They've got to be brought from other countries and checked and all the rest of it. That will take time. But the Europeans, both individually and collectively in the EU, are now beginning to really get behind Ukraine. And the American decision on US aid on Saturday, in a sense, will galvanize that, I think. It will actually create the situation whereby the Europeans now have got to get behind the American act. It challenges them to do the same, and they need to be seen to do the same. Because I think the message has got through to European leaders, most of them, if not to all of their publics, that this is serious. This is not a war of choice. I mean, Putin is making war in Europe and threatening everybody. And unless he is seen to fail, we will all be a great deal poorer and less sensitive. And I think that message is now clear. I mean, different European countries have different views of what they should do about it, but very few European leaders and European publics now think we shouldn't do anything about it. We should just leave it. Most Europeans now understand that this is our problem and we've got to take it on. And I think that's very different to the situation of a year ago.
Now, Rishi Sunak is actually in Poland today, and it will announce a £500 million package of military funding and equipment for Ukraine. The Prime Minister will also meet with his Polish counterpart, Donald Tusk, to discuss deepening UK-Poland relations and to hold talks with the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg. We'll be hearing from our political editor, Kate McCann, who's travelling with the Prime Minister just after 8. But first, let's speak to Jerome Starkey, who's defence editor at The Sun. Good morning to you.
Morning, Asma.
So how does this where does this stand? £500 million package of military funding and equipment for Ukraine. Where does this stand in what's been announced before?
Well, the government saying it brings the UK aid for this financial year to £3 billion. There have been three consecutive annual packages of aid from the UK, which has placed Britain around third in the rankings in terms of bilateral aid to Ukraine after America, which is in terms of military aid out in front. But Germany has donated about 18 billion, and this would bring the UK's total contribution since the start of the full-scale invasion to somewhere north of about 9.5 billion, if my math is correct, never my strong suit. But so it is significant, and of course comes as Ukraine has ramped up its appeals for donations and specifically for military assistance. I mean, it's been a constant refrain from Kyiv since the start of the war, but it's become particularly acute in recent months, and that's really down to the deadlock we saw in Washington over a massive $61 billion aid package that was held up in Congress because of opposition from Republicans. That today is expected to pass. So after 5 months of wrangling in America, that $61 billion aid package, it's been approved by the House of Representatives. It's due to get rubber stamp approval signed off by the Senate. And that will mean that potentially American weapons will start arriving in Ukraine within days. Now, obviously, anything the United Kingdom can donate will complement that, but I think at the moment the real game changer is what's been happening in America.
Of course. In terms then of what Rishi Sunak is announcing today, as I said, it's £500 million of military funding and equipment. Is there anything new within that, or is it what we have already supplied?
My understanding is it's more of what the UK has already supplied. I mean, the UK's focus, the weapons that the UK has donated have been incredibly wide. I mean, you talked earlier, or rather in the news bulletin, about the 4 million rounds of ammunition. I mean, most crucially, what Ukraine needs is heavy artillery ammunition. That's quite difficult to get hold of. It's in short supply and high demand. Clearly, I suspect, given the numbers, the 4 million rounds, that's likely to include small arms ammunition as well. I mean, bullets to keep assault rifles firing. But the UK has also talked about drones, made a real focus on its support for Ukraine's autonomous weapons. We've provided the Storm Shadow missiles before, which have played a crucial role in some of Ukraine's most spectacular strikes, not least against Russian naval assets, ships, submarines, and indeed a Navy headquarters in Sebastopol. But the UK is also focused specifically on maritime autonomous vehicles and supporting the campaign in the Black Sea. Now, that is where Ukraine does appear to have had some of its most spectacular successes, whilst the fighting on the front lines along the land conflict, if you like, has been pretty slow, deadly, expensive for both sides, both in terms of men and munition, and not a lot of land changing hands for huge amounts of lives and materiel. The fight that's been happening in the Black Sea has been very different, and that's where you have seen spectacularly successful attacks, both on ships at sea, ships in port. There was a submarine in dry dock, the first time a Russian submarine had been destroyed since the end of World War II. And also, just within the last few days, Ukraine managed to hit an air defense battery, a Russian air defense battery in Crimea. And by taking that out, we would expect to see other high value assets have been left vulnerable, and so worth waiting to see what happens there. I mean, elsewhere, what Ukraine has been doing with success, where it's been scoring goals, if you like, has been its long-range strikes deep into Russian territory. And this is something which has caused some anxiety in America, because some of these strikes have been aimed at oil refineries and at Russia's energy infrastructure. And the US concerned that that would push up prices on the global market, fuel inflation, and make life more difficult in terms of the cost of living for Americans. But nonetheless, that has been something that the Ukraine has been determined to pursue, and something where Ukraine has been having success.
Just very briefly, because some people have taken their eye off the situation in Ukraine, and you've talked about a few small victories for Ukraine. But would you say that over the last year that anything has shifted, or has it remained the same?
No, I think over the last year, the momentum, Ukraine's momentum has ground slowly to a halt, certainly in the land domain. And Russia, where there have been advances on the battlefield, they have been Russia's. So it was about a year ago, it was last May, that we saw Russia finally capturing Bakhmut, the city that had been the focus of its fury for many, many, many months. And then earlier this year, in February, we saw Russia take Avdiivka, a similar conflict, or a similar assault, which saw many, many lives lost in order to advance into what was effectively the shell of a devastated town. But nonetheless, both of these symbolic victories for Russia, the only real movement on the battlefield over the last year has been that. I mean, Ukraine did have some success with its summer counteroffensive in sort of late summer last year. They managed to advance into a place called Orekhiv in the south central Zaporizhia district. But by and large, over the last 12 months, the movement on the battlefield in the land domain hasn't been very fast or very far, especially if you think back to the beginning of the conflict, when there were those huge assaults, counter-assaults by Ukraine in Kharkiv in the northeast and Kherson in the south, where Russian forces were swept back, scores of miles at a time. And also we saw, of course, we can't forget the Russian retreat from their initial assault on Kyiv. But those Ukrainian victories do seem, they feel further and further away in the past.
Okay, Jerome, thank you for that. That's Jerome Starkey, defence editor at The Sun.
Rishi Sunak's in Poland now, where he's shoring up the UK's commitment to Ukraine in its war with Russia, promising another £500 million worth of funding. 2 years on from Russia's invasion, it looks like Ukraine is on the back foot. The Prime Minister says he's giving the money ahead of what could be a difficult summer for the Ukrainians. William, do we need to whisper this, but the chances of this war coming to an end with a Russian either stalemate or victory, is that closer than ever? Are you worried that Ukraine are actually going to lose this war, or at least going to be compelled to sue for peace?
Well, I was worried until Saturday, and what happened on Saturday was very, very important in world affairs, that the US House of Representatives passed a $61 billion aid bill for Ukraine. And it's not just the money, of course, that matters, it's what that buys, because that covers a lot of technology and weapons that only the United States possesses. So that will make very quickly make a big difference. A lot of that is ready to ship out in the coming days. So I think Ukraine now will get a new surge of support. That does not mean the war is over, but it means it's not easy for the Russians in that situation to win. Russia can probably keep going at this rate. The experts say, the think tanks say on defense, a couple of years like this. So sadly, the outlook is still for a long war, but it's not easy for either side to just knock out the other. Certainly, if Ukraine receives this sort of support, and the support that's being announced today by the UK is also really good because it's actually very important bits of military kit, like more Storm Shadow missiles, and some boats and maritime artillery. This sort of stuff really counts.
Kezia, do you think there's a danger that people care less and less in this country, in America as well? People say we've got all sorts of problems. You know, lots of talk about we need to spend 2.5% of money on defense. Lots of people say we need to spend more and more in supporting Ukraine because it's our war in Europe, and we need to fight it to stop Russia doing anything else. Do you think that mentality will continue for year after year after year, or at some point do you think there will be a groundswell, as there already is in the Republican Party in America, where they say, do you know what, this is not our fight, this is not a good use of our money?
I think we're in a difficult bit of phasing right now, in the sense that, you know, we're going to have a general election in the United Kingdom this year, and general elections make us selfish. They make us focus on our own living standards, our own circumstances, our own experiences of the NHS. And the media encourages us to think about that and to reflect on what we'll do with that information when it comes to the ballot box. That means what's happening in Ukraine isn't at the forefront of our minds, or indeed at the forefront of our political debate. But I don't fear that. I'm not concerned by that, because there is such political consensus in the UK, across Europe, and now thankfully in America, about why we need to defeat Putin's attempt to take over in Ukraine. And I think that's pretty resolute. Now, listening to William talk about the reality that this could be running for another 2 years, I think we've all got it within ourselves to support this for another 2 years. The question is, you know, are the public prepared to do this indefinitely? And some of that is about political education, right? That's about us all understanding that we live in an increasingly insecure world, and defence spending is going to have to go up to respond to that. We need our politicians to lead us in that debate, not expect us just to fall in line.
Yeah, and 2 years is one thing, 5 years is another, 10 years is another, and that's a question that only time will tell.
Sunak is in Poland today. He's announcing a record amount of military aid to Ukraine. He's going to pledge an extra £500 million for Ukraine before he flies to Germany to discuss defence issues with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Joining me now is Jamie Shea. He's the former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General. Welcome to the show, Jamie.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good to be back with you.
Yes, you're a very well-known name. You were ubiquitous a few years ago when you were speaking for NATO, so it's good to speak to you. I mean, the £500 million, I've described it as a record amount of military aid to Ukraine. I mean, Britain has no shame in terms of the amount of money it has given to Ukraine, but obviously it's a drop in the ocean compared to the $60 billion that the Americans have just pledged.
Well, yes, you're right. And the EU, of course, also voted 50 billion euros just a couple of weeks back. But the UK matters. Number one, the UK was one of the first to get into the game under the Prime Ministership of Boris Johnson, of course, in assisting Ukraine, the first to hand over tanks and the first to hand over cruise missiles. So it's really played a role punching above its weight, particularly in terms of support for Kiev. The second thing is that this package contains the sort of things that the Ukrainians really do need desperately. 1,600 missiles and air defense systems, 4 million rounds of ammunition. These may not be sort of jet aircraft or tanks, but given the situation on the battlefield at the moment, these air defense systems, this ammunition, if it can be supplied quickly, is really going to be a shot in the arm for the Ukrainians. So don't write off the UK. It plays a very important role because it tends to lead where others follow.
And it's a good point, Jamie, isn't it? That what the Prime Minister is announcing, the money is sort of there as the sort of headline, but actually he's announcing the transfer of real weapons in real time. There's a big difference between doing that and perhaps what the Americans have said, which is here's the money. But how quickly is American material likely to get to Ukraine?
Well, it's true that in the past, the supplies from the United States have often not been speedy. There's always, of course, the bureaucracy of getting export licenses and signing off on these type of things. But the other thing is often the Pentagon has had a bit of a debate about whether it should supply Ukraine immediately from existing stocks or whether it should go to defense industry and say, look, we need you to manufacture 100 Abrams tanks for Ukraine, which can take months or even years. But the Pentagon has been waiting a long time, obviously, as you well know, for Congress finally to get its act together and to pass this $61 billion package. So they've had time to at least identify the equipment and the stocks so that they're ready to go as soon as the Senate, hopefully today, follows the House of Representatives and approves this package. It would have been very negligent of them not to do this homework and be ready to go. The second piece of good news for the Ukrainians is it seems that the United States is ready immediately to supply the so-called ATACMS long-range artillery system, which the Ukrainians have been asking for a long time. It has a range of about 160 kilometers, which means that it's ideal for the Ukrainians to strike at the Russian rear echelons to prevent the massing for a major spring offensive, which of course is what everybody has predicted at the moment. So yes, there have been some bottlenecks in the past, but of course the United States is very mindful of the rather difficult, I won't say desperate, but difficult situation that the Ukrainian army is now in, having run out of a lot of ammunition and missiles and air defense. So I assume that they've made their preparations to get these supplies flowing as quickly as possible.
Brilliant. Well, Jamie Shea, thank you.
Let's turn now to get the view of Lord Richard Dannatt, crossbench peer and former head of the British Army, to really try and understand what this means in practice. A very good afternoon from us.
Hello, good afternoon to you.
Right, could you talk us through this in terms that we are really going to understand about what a 2.5% of GDP by 2030 commitment actually looks like?
Well, the first thing is that it's good news that we've got a hardened promise from the current Prime Minister of raising our defence spending from about 2.2% to 2.5% by the end of the decade. Now, that's actually still quite a long way away. That's 5 or 6 years away. But listening carefully to what he was saying, it does seem that there are significant amounts of new money, additional money. It's difficult to actually quantify it, but we're talking about between 10 and 20 billion pounds a year extra every year between now and 2030. And that is good news from the defence budget's point of view. Whether 2.5% by 2030 is enough, I'm afraid still remains as an open question. And there are a number of us, of which I'm one, who have been arguing that actually getting to 3% would be a more appropriate figure, given the uncertainty in the world at the present moment, and particularly given the continued aggression by Russia into Ukraine. But to give current Prime Minister his due, he has pledged more money year on year while it's needed for Ukraine. That's important. He's pledged to put our industry, our defence industry, on a war footing. Now, the important thing about that is that hitherto, particularly ammunition manufacturers, have been hesitant to gear up their production lines because they haven't been confident that there would be sufficient funds coming forth from the government. Well, the Prime Minister today has pledged that that will be the case, so they can up their production of ammunition. And then the third priority he pointed to, as far as I can recall, is innovation and improving the quality of the weapons available across the three armed services. So I think it's fair to say these are considerable steps in the right direction. But is he going far enough? Is he going fast enough? I'm afraid that's where the debate will be in the future.
Yeah. So if we can just quantify this, it would be an extra £70 billion on core defence spending over 6 years. What does that actually buy? I mean, is it possible to give examples of what that means?
Well, you can look right across the board at various projects. Let's take the Carrier Strike Programme. We know that we currently have not bought the number of F-35 aircraft that we have pledged and always said previously that we wanted to buy to fly off our aircraft carriers to make them credible. So as soon as additional money is available, then we can put an additional order in for F-35 aircraft. By the same token, there are something like 20 new ships for the Royal Navy on the drawing board at the present moment. Again, some of these are just on the drawing board and not funded. But so if there are additional funds coming forward, it'll mean that some of that shipbuilding can be accelerated. Now, all these things, of course, are good for British jobs. Then thirdly, and this, of course, is where I'm parochially rather more interested in, the Army has got considerable equipment spending plans, particularly for air defence and for field artillery, the sort of artillery that the Ukrainians have been using a lot of in Ukraine. in the last couple of years. Now, only 20% of the programs that the Army wants to see funded are currently out to contract. So 80% of Army uplift contracts need to be funded. Now, having talked in the last little while to one or two contacts in the Ministry of Defence, there is a concern that, as ever in the Ministry of Defence, trying to find enough money to balance the books in the next 12 months is a big problem for them. So they're going to look to see some of this money coming forward early to balance the books for the coming year. And the other thing to say, which is not welcome news, is there is a black hole, in particular the defence equipment budget, of somewhere between 15 and 20 billion pounds. So if this extra money is coming forward, there's going to be a negative use of some of that, and that is to fill in the black hole between aspiration and what is funded.
Right, so that's the result, isn't it, of the cross-party Public Accounts Committee. So that said in March that the gap between the MOD budget and the cost of military capabilities might be £29 billion. So that is that's paying off the overdraft, isn't it, before you can actually make any new purchases. Yeah.
Before anybody gets sort of party political about it, and I'm a crossbencher, so I'm not going to, it's worth remembering that in 2010, when David Cameron's government came in, there was around a 40 billion black hole in the defence budget. So this isn't new. This is over aspiration, over ambition in the Ministry of Defence, not matching the amount of funding that's available. It's a perennial problem, and it does need to be gripped.
Lord Dannatt, thank you very much indeed for your time. We appreciate that this afternoon. That is Lord Richard Dannatt, crossbench peer, as he said, former head of the British Army.
President Rishi Sunak's pledge to lift UK defence spending to 2.5% of national earnings, GDP, by the end of the decade, arguing the increase is necessary because the world is in its most dangerous state since the end of the Cold War. The PM made the announcement at a joint press conference in Warsaw with Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary-General of NATO.
In a world that's the most dangerous it's been since the end of the Cold War, we cannot and must not be complacent. As Churchill said in 1934, to urge the preparation of defence is not to insert the imminence of war. On the contrary, if war was imminent, preparations for defence would be too late. I believe we must do more to defend our country, our interests, and our values. So today I'm announcing the biggest strengthening of our national defence for a generation. We will increase defence spending to a new baseline of 2.5% of GDP by 2030. That starts today and rises steadily in each and every year. Over the next 6 years, we'll invest an additional £75 billion in our defence. And it will be fully funded with no increase in borrowing or debt.
Well, Rishi Sunak set out what the package would include.
Now, we will have 3 immediate priorities for this new investment. First, we will put the UK's own defence industry on a war footing. One of the central lessons of the war in Ukraine is that we need deeper stockpiles of munitions, and for industry to be able to replenish them more quickly. So today we're giving £10 billion in munitions support to give industry long-term funding certainty, backed by long-term contracts, so that they can produce more, be readier to surge capacity, and to move to always-on production when required. From surface-to-air missiles made in Bolton to anti-tank weapons in Belfast, we will replenish our stockpiles, all while supporting British jobs right across the Union.
Rishi Sunak also announced a further £500 million to support Ukraine. The Secretary-General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, praised what he called Britain's cast-iron commitment to supporting Ukraine.
And once again, the UK is leading by example. Just as you did in 2014, after the illegal annexation of Crimea, when you were one of the first allies to provide training and military support to Ukraine. And after the full-scale invasion in 2022, you stepped up significantly, training thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and providing billions of pounds of military assistance. And today, your announcement of additional support, including more ammunition, air defense, and deep precision strike capabilities, shows once again the British people's commitment to Ukraine. I welcome your cast iron commitment to continue these levels of support to Ukraine for as long as needed.
It's Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General. Now, let's welcome to the show, first of all, James Heappey, the Conservative MP and a former Armed Forces Minister. Welcome to you, James.
Good evening, John. How are you?
I'm well, thank you for joining us. So this extra 2.5% by 2030, is that a significant announcement, and is it enough, James?
Yes. I mean, look, to both of your questions. Yes, it's a significant announcement. Put it in perspective. If the Prime Minister had done something different, if he had said, I've got £75 billion worth of announcement and I'm going to do 40 billion on hospitals, 20 billion on schools, 15 billion on roads, or the whole 75 billion on tax cuts, that would be incredible news. And instead he's chosen to put 75 billion on defence. That's the first time in my lifetime that a prime minister would have chosen that priority in an election year. I think it's the right decision. It reflects the geopolitical reality of the world around us, and that the first priority of government is the defence and security of the realm. But the sort of scale of it is seismic. Now, people will argue that it should be more, it should come faster. I think that is churlish on a day like today, when the scale of the announcement is what it is. And what this money will do is mean that our armed forces, as they currently are, will be lethal, more sustainable, more resilient, and that therefore strengthens our conventional deterrence and ultimately makes it less likely that our adversaries will try and take us on.
Right. Now, some of our listeners, James, who pay attention to defence issues might remember Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, speaking at the NATO summit in Madrid in June 2022. Just have a listen back.
We need to invest for the long term in vital capabilities like future combat air, while simultaneously adapting to a more dangerous and more competitive world. And the logical conclusion of the investments on which we propose to embark, of these decisions, is that we will reach 2.5% of GDP on defence by the end of the decade.
So that's the former Prime Minister, and that was Boris Johnson setting out the priorities and the urgency and the need for this spending. Why, some may wonder, why has it taken Rishi Sunak 2 years to restate that policy now?
Well, I think the Prime Minister would say that he inherited a financial situation in which he didn't feel he was able to make that commitment. And in fairness, when I was seeing who I might support in the two leadership elections that have happened since Boris Johnson made that speech in Madrid, Rishi was very clear that he did not feel able to match the 2.5 commitment that Boris and Liz had both previously made.
Right.
And I, huge credit to him that he has both achieved the fiscal conditions he feels he needs to achieve, but B, that he, as a consequence of, he's in the hot seat. He's in these G7, G20 summits all the time.
Yes.
Think about the meetings he's had over the last couple of weeks, reflecting on the threat from Iran. And he's come to the obvious conclusion, but with an enormous political choice. Go back to that point I made up front, John, about all the things he could have spent £75 billion on in a manifesto as a promise for the next Parliament.
Yes.
And instead it's gone on defence and security. I think he deserves a lot of credit.
Yeah, well, I don't doubt the validity of the spending commitment or the need for it. We discuss it on this programme almost every day. But I guess an election coming, that won't be insignificant in the calculation, will it?
No, but look, I mean, all political strategists over the last sort of 6-7 general elections would have told you that the only thing that really matters is an auction over a commitment to the NHS, or maybe the sort of pension spending, whatever else. There are more immediately politically advantageous things that you could announce that sort of money to spend on.
Yes.
Now, I think that that reflects the Prime Minister being in the hot seat and reacting to the world around him and the threat that he can see to the UK interest, and the fact that, as he set out in his speech, you need to give industry the cue to start scaling. It can't just be switched on like that. So this is the right time to make the commitment. But I also think that the British public are increasingly aware of the challenge to our national security. And so I think that the sort of political importance of defence is increasing.
Yeah. No, I've been accepting, if you like, for the purpose of our conversation, the importance of this spending and the importance of national defence at a really difficult time. But also, the fiscal questions do need to be addressed. I mean, while the Prime Minister makes this pledge, you're also, or the Prime Minister and his senior ministers are also promising to abolish national insurance. That's a cost of £46 billion. And if there's going to be a pre-election budget, there'll be more tax giveaways there too. I mean, how could it be possible to promise all of those things?
Well, I'm going to indulge in the luxury of no longer being the government spokesperson and not.
It's a legitimate question, James.
No, John. I'm not. But I simply don't know the answer, and I'd be speculating if I did. My understanding from the conversation I had with the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary earlier today is that he has taken the decision to spend the proceeds of quite a big cross-Whitehall efficiency drive on this, and that has consequences for other parties who might have had their eye on that money for other things, particularly if those parties go on to match this commitment on defence.
Which is why I do wonder if this is also, as other challenges have been, other policy announcements in the last recent days have been challenges to the Labour Party. Now, the clip we heard there from Boris Johnson.
There's a thing there. There is a thing there, John. Of course there is. But I would prefer to not make the partisan point. I would actually make it. I'd turn the issue around. If Keir Starmer and his team were to, yes, it would cost them a number of other policies because they would have to spend that money on this instead. But the message it sends to Putin of complete political consensus within the UK on defence spending is enormously powerful, and in itself contributes to the deterrent effect of increased defence capability. So I'll let other colleagues try and make more nakedly political points. I actually hope that Labour will see the strategic advantage, not politically, but for the UK internationally, in matching the commitment, because I think that sends a real message to allies and adversaries alike.
Right, but a spending commitment can have merit in its own rights and be a political stroke. Those two things are not mutually exclusive.
Agreed.
I mean, the Boris Johnson promise we heard there back in 2022, that was just a few weeks before he was evicted from number 10 Downing Street. Would it be too cynical to say that this is also a self-defence policy for Rishi Sunak himself, as well as for Britain and the West?
Well, I would choose to view it more charitably. You can apply whatever analysis you want. I think that he's seen the situation that surrounds us. I think he's seen the real danger of the NATO summit in Washington in July, followed the week after by the Republican convention, and the need for European allies to turn up in Washington with a new tune to dance to. And I think what you saw, it was significant that Jens Stoltenberg was on the podium with Rishi in Poland today, because I think a bit like that summit at Celtic Manor in 2010, where Cameron and Obama achieved the 2% baseline, I think that there's a big opportunity for Sunak, Biden, Stoltenberg to try to make 2.5 the new baseline come the Washington summit. And that would confound an awful lot of the criticism of European NATO allies that you're likely to hear from the Republican convention otherwise.
All right. Good to get your thoughts, James. Thank you. James Heappey, the former Defence.
Republican Senator Ron Johnson, who joins us now. Hello to you. Senator, can we ask whether you'll vote this bill through?
I'll be voting no. And it's not that I don't have a great deal of sympathy for the freedom-loving people of Ukraine who've been invaded by a war criminal, Vladimir Putin, or the people of Israel who endured a horrible slaughter, brutal slaughter at the hands of Hamas, or the people of Taiwan who are being threatened by China. The problem is this is money we don't have. This isn't exactly coming from U.S. taxpayers right now. This is borrowed money. This is plundering our children's future. And we're not recognizing the reality, particularly in the Ukraine, where Vladimir Putin will not lose this war. And the other reality is there's very little push from my constituents to provide funding to help other countries secure their borders when we haven't first secured ours. And that was our first bottom line, is we were looking to force President Biden to use the authority he has to secure our own border, which is a clear and present danger to America, before we go ahead and spend $100 billion of money that we don't have that further mortgages our children's future. So again, there's a host of reasons, but in the end, I'm not going to support this package.
Now, many people might accuse you of being America first on that point of view, if you use a catchphrase that's been long associated with the Republican Party, particularly under Donald Trump. There is a border security bill at the moment, though. It was voted down at the weekend, but there is a border security bill there proposed, ready to deal with issues on a domestic front, as you say, with the problems concerning your own border security.
No, it was an awful bill. Again, President Trump had the authority in law to secure the border. He did so. President Biden used that exact same authority, and he opened up the border. The bill that was negotiated was only negotiated to provide Democrats for political cover. It codified 4,000 to 5,000 immigrants per day come to this country illegally. It would have actually weakened a president that was serious about securing a border. It would have weakened that president's authority. So it was an awful bill. It fell on its own awfulness. And again, I know Democrats are using it as political cover, but that was not the solution. The solution was some kind of enforcement mechanism to force President Biden to use the authority he has to secure the border. And might I add, I think most nations should consider their own citizens and their own nation first in considering any policy. That's the role of a nation. There's nothing wrong with that. If America is strong, the world is a more safe and prosperous place. Unfortunately, under President Biden, just about every action he has taken, the open borders, massive deficit spending, war on fossil fuel, the embarrassing and dangerous surrender in Afghanistan, has weakened America, emboldened the West's adversaries, people like Putin, people like President Xi, the Ayatollahs, Kim Jong-un. So we have to first start at how do we strengthen America, and another $100 billion in deficit spending does not strengthen America.
I think many people might say, and look, this bill will go through. It does have Republican backing largely, not from yourself, obviously, but many will say, well, it's a pretty embarrassing look that you're continuing to go against your party and to not advocate the smooth sailing through of this bill. It is a bad look to go out on a limb like this. Many of your fellow senators and colleagues share your concerns, but they can see where this is going, and to refuse aid to Ukraine and indeed the other countries involved is a bad look.
So where is this going? I hear Senator Schumer coming out of the White House saying this is simple. If Ukraine gets $60 billion, they win. If they don't, they lose. How are they going to win? Russia has 4 times the population. The average age of Ukrainian soldiers is 43 years. Russia can produce 4.5 times the number of 155 millimeter shells, which is being used in this bloody stalemate. My concern, because I am highly concerned about the people of Ukraine, I don't want to use the people of Ukraine as cannon fodder in a proxy war between the West and Russia. And I think that's exactly what this war has devolved into, a proxy war.
It does sound like you think Russia's
I don't want to see more Ukrainians die. I don't want to see Russian conscripts die. I don't want to see more of Ukraine destroyed because they'll have to be rebuilt. So again, where is this going? It's going nowhere. The $60 billion will go into a hole, and it will, in the end, when that's all gone, there will be no change. There will be no change. We'll still be in this bloody stalemate. So why spend another $60 billion?
It sounds like you're handing this war to Russia, that you're saying, that because we're at a stalemate, the only solution is to not further this war anymore, which would mean considering large parts of Ukraine to Vladimir Putin. Where else do you want it to go?
Where's the strategy to end this war? Tell me how Vladimir Putin loses this war without literally risking a nuclear exchange. It's just not possible. Why did the West pretty well blow up the peace negotiations in Istanbul short weeks after this war began? What was all that about? So there are many questions. I realize, our military industrial complex, I realize the narrative in the media is all about, we've got to be steadfast. But, the only guarantee we gave Ukraine, and I take these things seriously, is if they were invaded, we would take that invasion to the Security Council. That's it. We have far exceeded our commitment to Ukraine, far exceeded it. And again, I'm highly concerned about Ukrainian people, so I don't want to see more of them die. And I don't want to see more of Ukraine destroyed.
But they desperately want to hang on to their land.
Situation.
Yeah.
Others aren't.
Yeah, I mean, the Ukrainian people will say that they don't want to concede any of their land, that if you were to put a full stop on that war right now, it would involve Russia taking additional territory. It would involve Ukraine having to sign over land that they've called their own to Russia. There is the other point as well, actually, that the $61 billion, that the money allocated specifically for Ukraine in the aid package, will go a long way. It is an incredible amount of money. It will make a huge difference. And many will argue the reason why the war's reached a stalemate at the moment is because that money hasn't been committed. So no one knows where they stand. Ukraine are having to ration all of their weapons and, bullets, etc., shells. They're having to ration all of that because they've simply not known whether more money will arrive. And another thing that's happened, Senator Johnson, is you committing that money has meant that today, Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, has made a huge new commitment to Ukraine and the war effort. He's off to Germany tomorrow. Other Western leaders are set to do that as well. By you passing this bill, it puts confidence in the Western alliance behind Ukraine, and it makes other countries step up in their spending too. And that escalates a much better chance for Ukraine. It's not just about UK, it's the US giving that confidence to other nations.
So it's just the West throwing more money at a bloody stalemate. How do you break out that stalemate? They had their counteroffensive last summer. Unfortunately, it failed. I don't see success this summer either. Again, unless we are willing to risk a nuclear exchange with Russia. Again, Vladimir Putin won't lose this war. It's existential to Vladimir Putin. He has theater nuclear weapons. If it really got to that point, I don't doubt that he would actually use them. Is that what we want to push Russia to do? I don't think this war ever should have occurred. I think we could have dissuaded Vladimir Putin from invading, but we wouldn't do what we should have done, basically declared that we will not offer NATO membership to Ukraine. That was the red line. Now we have NATO Secretary General saying that absolutely Ukraine will become part of NATO. That's not going to help end the war.
Yeah.
So again, I see no strategy for ending this war. I see no strategy for winning this war. All I see is a strategy of spending money that we don't have, mortgaging our children's future. Once that money's gone, we'll be pretty much in the exact same position as we were prior to spending it. There's no strategy for success here.
I'll put my argument back to you that the reason why it's reached stalemate is because funding has dried up. And that's happened over the last 6 to 9 months.
I mean, I just disagree with that premise.
Okay. And to be clear, you fear that...
By the way, Europe is combined as large as the United States. If this is in Europe's backyard, if they're that concerned about it, they could step up the plate. They could provide that funding if that's really the reason why this is a stalemate. Europe could prevent that as well. But again, they're going to sit back and wait for the Americans to come to the rescue and spend $60 billion. That again will not turn the tide of this war.
So to be clear, your concern, Senator Johnson, is that if more money is thrown at Ukraine, $61 billion from the US and several other $1 billion from other Western nations, that will agitate Vladimir Putin to the point where you feel that a nuclear attack by Russia on Ukraine is inevitable.
I think that when all's said and done and this money is spent, we'll pretty much be in the exact same position. We will continue to be fighting a proxy war using Ukrainians as cannon fodder in that proxy war. More Ukrainians die, more Russian conscripts die, take no joy in that, and more Ukraine gets destroyed that'll have to be rebuilt in the future. So the only way this war ends is in a negotiated settlement. So we should have some kind of strategy to prompt Putin to enter negotiations. Telling him up front that Ukraine will become part of NATO is not a way to bring Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table. And again, Vladimir Putin's an evil war criminal. I harbor no fond feelings for the guy. I mean, he's an awful human being. I'm not going to like that settlement, but every day that goes by, the settlement gets worse because more people die and more Ukraine gets destroyed. That's the sad reality. It's the awful reality of the situation. And to not recognize that reality is just going to cost more people's lives and spend tens of billions more dollars that in the end will be wasted.
Do you think this will change if Donald Trump secures a second term as president?
I think he certainly would be dedicated to trying to end the war, which this president is not dedicated to doing.
Well, look, thank you so much for speaking to us today. Hugely appreciated. The Republican Senator Ron Johnson, thank you.
Have a good day.
The Prime Minister's pledged to increase UK spending on defence to 2.5% of GDP by 2030, was accompanied by his announcement of a further £500 million of British military support for Ukraine, including 400 vehicles, 1,600 munitions and 4 million rounds of ammunition. And it comes as the US Senate is expected to approve a $60 billion package of military aid for Ukraine, which was approved by the House of Representatives at the weekend after months of delay. Well, some Republicans opposed the deal. Earlier on Times Radio, Republican Senator Ron Johnson said the US should secure its own borders first.
I'll be voting no. And it's not that I don't have a great deal of sympathy for the freedom-loving people of Ukraine who've been invaded by a war criminal, Vladimir Putin, or the people of Israel who endured a horrible slaughter, brutal slaughter at the hands of Hamas, or the people of Taiwan who are being threatened by China. The problem is this is money we don't have. This isn't exactly coming from U.S. taxpayers right now. This is borrowed money. This is plundering our children's future. And we're not recognizing the reality, particularly in the Ukraine, where Vladimir Putin will not lose this war. And the other reality is there's very little push from my constituents to provide funding to help other countries secure their borders when we haven't first secured ours. And that was our first bottom line.
Well, how much difference will the latest package of US aid make to Ukraine's efforts to prevent Russian forces gaining more of its territory? Daniel Fried is a former US Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs and a former US ambassador to Poland. Good evening to you, Daniel.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Well, really good to have you with us. It looks as though the Senate will approve this latest package of aid for Ukraine, something that President Zelensky has been saying his forces desperately need. The House of Representatives, of course, did vote it through finally at the weekend. How significant a move do you think this will be?
Well, giving no further assistance would have been a catastrophe for the Ukrainians. And all of our problems in Europe and the United States would be worse if Ukraine lost, and that was the danger. Now, the assistance gives the Ukrainians a fighting chance, so to speak, for relative success. Much depends on how fast the U.S. can provide Ukraine with the arms, and what kind of arms. In particular, are we, the Americans, going to give the Ukrainians the longer-range attacker missiles, which would enable them to put more of Russian military infrastructure and bases inside Ukraine, especially at risk. So it is possible that the Ukrainians, with the extra assistance from the U.S. and Europe, can blunt Russian land offensives this fighting season and can degrade the Russian position generally by hitting them behind the lines. If they do that, the Russians may suffer casualties. Putin's desire for a win this year will be blunted, frustrated, and things by the time of as early as the NATO summit in Washington, better for Ukraine. So I'm not saying Ukraine will win with the assistance, but they have a reasonable chance, and the Biden administration people I speak to are operating on we have to be forward-leaning. We and the Europeans help the Ukrainians make the most of this new opportunity.
We're having a little bit of difficulty with your line. We'll stick with it for a moment and see if it stabilizes. President Biden, as I understand it, has given assurances that the US will send supplies as quickly as possible. But, I mean, in the past, it has taken quite some time to actually get supplies from the point where they're agreed in the US political system to actually getting them delivered. And, I mean, Russian forces have been gaining Ukrainian territory, haven't they?
You're right. The Ukrainians have been on the defensive. They've been losing ground. The administration people...
Oh, we seem to be losing Daniel Fried. We are just going to see if we can get a better connection so that we can hear what Daniel is saying, because the US Senate is now expected, perhaps even later tonight, to approve that big package of aid. There is money for Israel, there is some money for Taiwan, and there is that $60 billion of military support for Ukraine. And I should say that we're also hearing that the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who was in Poland earlier, is going to be in Germany. He's arrived there tonight, and he's going to be talking about the UK and Germany opening a new chapter in defence partnerships. We've got Daniel Fried back. Daniel, the question is, I mean, how quickly can that military support get through? Because the President Zelensky has been warning that Russia is gaining ground.
You're absolutely right. The administration has had time to prepare, and it would be inexcusable if, following the vote, the weapons didn't move quickly. But I am assured by people in the administration that they are prepared, they are ready to move the weapons quickly, which needs to happen. The faster, the better. You're absolutely right.
And we've had the British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, today announcing an increase in Britain's defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. He's also announced a further package of British aid to Ukraine. And it comes at a time when, as we were hearing from a defence expert earlier in the programme, it does look as though Europe is actually beginning to spend more to support Ukraine now.
And about time. Europe's assumptions that peace with Russia could be taken for granted and that the Americans would be there to clean up if that assumption was wrong have been shattered. I think Germany has had 2 generations worth of assumptions about Russia gone. The French President Macron has shifted from endlessly reaching out to Russia to recognizing the Russian threat. And it turns out that the Polish and Baltic positions about Russia have been proven right. It's about time that Europe stepped up. This is absolutely essential. Regardless of who wins the US elections, we need a stronger Europe, we need a stronger Britain, because our adversaries are in earnest. Putin is an aggressive dictator along, shall we say, 20th century lines. I don't know that President Xi of China will follow the same path with respect to Taiwan, but we have to be ready. It would be nice to say that the military balance of power is a consideration that belongs to the 20th century, but it belongs to the 21st. It's our issue right now.
And how much do you think that increase in defence spending amongst European nations, particularly European NATO members, is a recognition of the Russian threat? And how much of it is just, frankly, a concern that Donald Trump could return to the White House and that they can't rely on US spending on NATO to help to protect them?
I think it's the combination. I think the Russian threat is now real to Europeans who dismissed it until very recently. I think that the shock of Donald Trump's pronouncements about NATO has forced a lot of the Europeans to wake up and realize that military power is neither a luxury nor an anachronism. It is needed. That the European project and the free world order, if I can put it that way, are not self-sustaining automatically. We have to mean it. We have to put our backs into it. And an increase in military spending is important. I think the polls have gone up to 4% of their GDP, and they're going to go even higher. I think the West European countries need to increase their spending as well if we're going to get through this, and we can in very good shape if we put our backs to it.
Yeah, because as you say, Poland is getting up close to 4%. Britain now made that commitment to get to 2.5% by 2050, but many other NATO countries are still quite some way behind that, aren't they?
Well, the trends are moving in the right direction. The Poles, the Baltic countries are there. Germany needs to spend more. I know they've got economic problems because their industry was based on cheap energy from Russia, and that's no longer there. The French need to put more into their military, but the trends are moving in the right direction. And this is not because of American lecturing. It's because the threat from Putin appears real to Europeans and because worries about the United States have grown. Whatever happens in our elections, and I personally hope Biden wins, we need a stronger Europe and a militarily strong UK.
As you say, we are still some months off the US election. It's going to be a close fought thing. Given what Donald Trump has said about his commitment to NATO, he made those comments, perhaps slightly flippantly, saying, well, any NATO member who, if they're not spending enough on their own defence, I don't see why we should rush to help them, which, of course, would undermine one of the basic principles of the NATO alliance. And given what he has said about Russia and Ukraine in the past, if President Trump did return to the White House, what do you think his approach to the war in Ukraine would be?
That's a key question. And I think it is possible that despite all his awful comments, which are based on what I consider to be an awful set of strategic assumptions that recall the America First movement of 1940 and 41, which was, by the way, indifferent to European security and British struggles against Hitler. I think despite this, there is a chance that Trump could shift his views. Some of the people around him have hinted that Trump would be prepared to take credit for the increases in European military spending and then claim that he saved NATO. I'm not saying Europeans have to like that, but they might find it in their interest if Trump is elected to accept it. It is also interesting to me that last week, just before the House of Representatives broke with the hard isolationist right and voted the assistance for Ukraine, Trump, in the middle of a tweet, acknowledged that Ukraine's survival and strength, his words, survival and strength was in American interest. That was the first time I think he's ever said that. I don't think he was saying that because he had had a shift in strategic orientation, but because he saw the way the debate in Congress was going. And if that's true, that means that, let's say, political opportunism might trump, so to speak, Donald Trump's strategic instincts. Now, I don't know this to be true, but it is at least worth considering. And I'm glad that the British Prime Minister and the Polish President have met with Trump. I think this sort of thing can be useful.
And just finally, of course, we're talking about that increase in Britain's defence spending, about the new package of aid from the United States, other European allies also sending more money to Ukraine. But of course, Russia is absolutely pouring money into its defence forces. I think it's 7.8%. It has vast numbers of conscripts and an economy very much geared up to ever-increasing defence spending. How great do you think are the risks at the moment that we could be reaching a turning point in the Ukraine war, with Russia facing the real prospect that it could win?
I think without the American aid, Russia stood a very good chance of winning the war. And that would have been a catastrophe, and it would have opened the way to yet more catastrophes. I think now the battle in Ukraine is open. I think the Ukrainians have a much greater chance of success. And if reasonable best case scenario for Ukraine, if the Ukrainians manage to blunt Russian land offensives this summer and strike deeper into Russian and Russian-held territory, Putin's war may turn against him. And in that case, well, Russian history over the past 150 years shows that when Russia starts aggressive wars and loses, political change can follow. I would not assume that Putin's position is great if he loses. If Russia does not succeed in its war, Putin's position could become difficult. And the notion that Russia never loses a war, or just because Putin is committed to this war means he automatically will win, is ahistoric. It doesn't matter how committed he is, he might lose. We have to think not just what Putin's going to do to us, but what we're going to help the Ukrainians do to him.
Daniel Fried, former US Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, also a former US ambassador to Poland. Really good to speak to you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.